Well, that was a super rocky, super long intro. So we're excited to have you guys on tonight because we are going to be talking about the different types of editing, something that we get a million questions about in our Facebook group. And to help us out with this topic, we have Arielle Bailey, who is an editor and author, and she is my editor. So I'm really super excited about our topic tonight. Before we get into it, though, first of all, Amy has a little, I don't know. What is this? An announcement? A explanation and explanation?
Yes. So, us tech, are you waving at me?
Yeah, I was like, wait.
Well, I said make sure I check first before you just throw me to the wolves. So we have a really super cool thing on our YouTube. Well, it's super cool to us, and I hope it's cool to you. It's called a super chat, and if you've ever watched any live YouTube channels now, they're doing super chats, and it's just a way for you to give a little love to the people who are giving you free content and who are coming to you to give you as much information as they possibly can. And so it's called a super chat, and what you do is you get a highlighted comment in our live feed, and so we 100% see it, and we can read your question, but we'll probably read your question anyways. It's just a way for you to support our podcast. Any amount is awesome, even if it's $1 and you just want to tell us that you love us and you want to see us more and you want to support us, that would be great. We'll for sure read the super chats and give you the golden nugget that we've been holding back and not saying.
Yeah.
If you pay us, we will tell you.
If you want to unlock the secrets,
we will give it to you. But seriously though, I mean, anything you can do to help us, and you want to give us some love, we would definitely appreciate that. And it's only on the YouTube, so you actually have to go to the YouTube channel to donate. But it's just a way for us to, we're not getting paid to do any of this. And if you love us and you want to see more of our content, then we were more than happy to have you give us a super chat. So there you go.
We'll have that going on for a while. Okay, so tonight we're going to just touch base with everybody. And so, Victorine, can you tell us what you had going on this week?
Yes, I can. This week I have been working completely on all my PowerPoints for our conference. And you guys, I'm so excited to share them with you. I am putting together all my information, and I've just got some really great content to share with you guys. I just finished up my presentation on different income streams for a writer. And I went to a class at RWA on that, and I did some more digging around and came up with even more ideas than they had in the class. And I'm super excited about it. And some of these things I'm researching and going, oh, I should be doing that too. I should be doing that too. So I'm just so excited to share that with you guys. So that's what I've been doing this week.
That's awesome. I need to be doing more of that this week. You and Judy are putting me to shame. All right, Anne-Marie, what have you accomplished this week? Because I know you had a big win.
Yes. So I have a book that's supposed to launch at the end of the month, and I was only halfway through it at the end of last week. And I was like, oh, I got to get this finished. And then I was even wondering if I was going to get it finished by the end of the month. But then I got a book bub on the first book in series at the end of on next Saturday. And so I was like, well, I really should get this book written. So the last 3 days I wrote 23,000 words and busted out the book. It is done. It is now to my editor, and I can kind of sit back and relax. This was my last of the crazy books I have to get done. My next ones, my pre-orders aren't until way later in the year, so I can take as much time as I need to. And really, and I think that's super important because we need to be focusing on selling the books that we have, especially when you get to a point like I am, and I have 40 plus books in my backlist, that I should be really selling those books instead of creating new content. And so I've been, I had to tie up some other series and stuff, but now I can just really focus on one series right in there, do some of my co-writing, which doesn't take me very long because there's 2 of us writing in it. But it's really important to make sure that you're focusing on advertising as well. So I'm really excited to be able to like do all of the things that I have pushed to the back burner. And one of those is my classes. So I will be doing that soon. But yeah, getting that up for our conference. I got all of our books for our big giveaway that we're going to do to send somebody a package. So we're really excited. And the information that we're going to be teaching is just going to be invaluable.
Agreed. And Judy's been working on her classes too. What else? Oh, you're muted, Judy. You look cute, but you're muted.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. So yeah, I've been working on my classes for the conference. I have 2 of them recorded, which is, a relief because I get stressed when I have things hanging over my head. So I did that. I haven't really done any writing because I was doing all that stuff. But I just have 1 more class to record, and then I can hopefully just focus on working on my next book. So that's basically what I've been doing.
Same. And Arielle, so it's just amazing timing, has the really cool thing that she's finished too. So tell us about it.
Well, I'm actually still 11th hour finishing a couple of things before I send it to my formatter tomorrow, but my first book is almost off to my formatter. Almost.
Yay!
I have 100 pages left that I just have to fine tune a few things and go back and change metric system back to the imperial system.
So tell us the title and your elevator pitch, because it's really cool.
The title is The Icarus Aftermath, and the elevator pitch is Greek mythology meets Star Wars.
Ooh, that's
So
cool.
it's space opera, science fantasy. So yeah, I'm excited.
It's really awesome. I'm excited to read it. I can't wait. And just like Arielle's got her book almost published, I did get mine published. The one that's been the bane of my existence for 4 months.
Yes.
I'm so excited to have it done, have it out.
And you did a great job on it.
Thank you. I was super worried about different things, but so far readers are responding the way I hoped they would. So I'm excited and enthusiastic about writing again, but no writing for me right now because I too have conference classes. I'm currently working on my Secret Life of Secondary Characters, and I've been working with Arielle because we're teaching a class on navigating the author-editor relationship. And so we're going to use that to kind of segue into our editing tonight. She's also teaching a class called Polishing Your Diamonds. So we're going to have a couple of great editing classes from Arielle. I was trying to say Arielle because of how it's spelled, but she says it's Arielle. So just so you know, I'm not pronouncing it wrong. Okay. So we're going to talk about the different types of editing tonight because it's really confusing what they all mean. And when I've looked it up, there isn't even an industry standard for what they all mean exactly. And so it gets even more confusing. Yeah. So we're going to just touch base tonight. I really wanted to talk about developmental editing, content editing, line editing, copy editing, and proofreading, because those are the 5 major ones that you'll see. Sometimes you'll see them called by slightly different names. But in general, those are the main types of editing that you might want to get on your book. So we're just going to go through them one at a time. And the rest of you ladies, if you have at any point have any questions that you want to have Arielle elaborate on, just feel free to jump in, because we all kind of have different editing processes with our books that we've developed over the years. So first of all, I kind of want to talk about beta readers before we get into the editing type. So Arielle, what's your opinion on beta readers and what role they play in our process?
Well, it's occasionally an unpopular one, so that's just a warning. Beta readers are absolutely essential. I adore beta readers, but in my experience, beta readers work best for an author's process when they focus on telling the author what the story made them feel or didn't make them feel. Because then the author figures out, are they hitting the story beats they want to hit? Are they not hitting them? Is something not coming through very well? Or this particular thing, you just phrased it like he was condoning kissing your sister, and what he actually meant was not kissing your sister. True story, that happened. And beta readers are there to help you work through that. I know some authors prefer to have their beta readers edit for them. That can wind up being tricky in my experience, just because most beta readers are not trained editors at all. And I'm not saying you have to be professionally trained, just there are a lot of editing nuances that most beta readers just aren't aware of, or that they completely miss. And when they start picking apart your story with an editorial perspective, it can actually harm your writing, in my experience, just because they start giving you all this kind of advice, and pretty soon you're like, you understanding the story at all? Am I totally off the wall here? Did anything I wrote in this book make any sense at all? So generally, they're the first step in your editing process. You send your first draft to them, or your second draft. I'm more a second draft person because some of my first drafts can be pretty messy. And then they just tell you what they feel. And then you can go off of that, because primarily we want our stories to make people feel things, right? We want them to connect, and you connect primarily through emotion. Even those of us who aren't emotional people, you connect with a story and with characters because you feel what they feel. And so a beta reader, their job is to tell you, hey, I am feeling what this character is feeling. Wow, I hate you. You killed that person. How could you? Or is that just my beta readers? And then
We don't kill a lot of people in romances.
True,
Yeah.
true, you don't. It's kind of nice. Going in, okay, I'm not going to be crying over these characters. Probably.
Cry in different
At least
ways.
I'm not going to be crying over them being dead. Yes. Exactly.
Exactly.
So they're definitely important, but my usual advice is don't ask your betas to edit for you. And for me personally, it doesn't work well if they point out typos to me, because then I'm like, you're focusing on the typos. You're not focusing on whether the story made you feel happy or sad or upset or whatever. You're just telling me about these typos. It's a first draft. There are going to be typos. I'll go back and clean it up later. Can you please just tell me what the story felt like?
Yeah, I wasted a lot of time.
Definitely. Yeah.
What were you saying, Judy? I think we have a little bit of a delay.
Yeah, sorry. I was just saying I wasted a lot of time editing people's things, like adding commas and stuff. So it's good to know you don't need to do that.
So, would beta reading be best before or after a developmental edit, for example? Just like before you start the whole professional editing process, do you think?
Usually, yes. Occasionally, the story either has enough problems or you're new enough in your writing journey. Like a lot of very, very new writers, they will need beta reading, and then they'll need actually more of a critique instead of a developmental edit. And then they'll need a rewrite or a complete overhaul, and then need to go back to beta readers again before starting the editing process. But usually, yes, your beta readers are your first step, and they can read. A lot of people call the readers who read along as you write alpha readers. I don't tend to do much with alpha reading just because it doesn't work as well for me, except for like 2 people. I can send my story as I'm writing it to them, and that's it. But otherwise, I have to get the thing down and finished, because there are usually details that get changed along the way. And then I'm like, hey, this thing is different. This is not. But yes, beta readers are your first step. You get your beta reader feedback. You think about it. If you're still not sure about some of it, then you can include that in feedback to your editor when you go for developmental edit. But in general, your beta reader feedback, because it tells you what the story made them feel, is your first step on the road to editing and publishing.
Awesome. Okay, so we've talked about beta reading in other podcasts, so we'll just kind of skip over that, and we're going to focus on more now on the professional end of it. So can you describe what a developmental edit would involve?
For me personally, it involves, I read your story usually in a single day if I can, otherwise 2 or 3 days, depending on how long it is. I mean, most romances I've read don't go over 50,000 words. Well, 53,000 words, Michelle. But then I think about it for a couple of days, and I process, and then I take 2 or 3 days to write down what you cover in a developmental edit is you look at the story structure. Is it hitting the beats that you think the author is wanting to hit? And you talk about that with them. You say, I think you're going for this, but I'm not totally sure. Can you explain this to me? Or you cover character arcs. So your story arc, your character arc, multiple character arcs usually, and the overall big picture of the story. Like, do you want this to have a sweet tone, or is it more of romantic suspense? So you want that mystery to be stronger than just the sweet romance? Or is it like a rom-com where you really need the comedy elements? And then that's the stage at which you pick out, okay, you don't really have a lot of comedy in this, so if you're going for a rom-com vibe, you're going to need to bring in more comedy. And your character, like, this girl's interesting, but your side characters are more interesting than your main characters. Yeah. Michelle and I went through that early on in her process. And that's basically the developmental stages. You go over the big picture, which is why it's important going into a developmental edit that you as the author know what you want your end product to look like in a vibe kind of way. Like, I know I want this to be rom-com, or I know I want this to be romantic suspense, because if you don't have that picture as the author, it's going to make it harder for you and the editor to work on the developmental edit. But it's basically the big picture, and hey, are you hitting these beats or aren't you?
So
and you just go back and forth until you get it right.
That's what I was going to ask. So do you sometimes go back and forth with the same author on, various attempts to get the story on track?
Yeah, the most we've done is, I think, 4 rounds, which was with a very complex and unique manuscript for somebody who was a first-time author. And ultimately, we only worked on her developmental edit. I think she needed a different editor to go further. But yes, in general, it doesn't take more than 2 rounds for me with any one client. Occasionally 3, but usually that's with epic fantasy. So we're talking 142,000 words, 160,000 words, and all of that is a little bit much to do in 1 or 2 rounds sometimes.
Just a lot of complexity. Yeah.
So when you do the multiple rounds, sorry, I might be delayed. When you do the multiple rounds, do you read through it multiple times, or they just kind of explain what they changed?
No, I read through it. If one round in particular targets specific areas, like if we do 1 round and then I read through it again and say, okay, pretty much this is great except for this spot, and this spot. Then when they send it back, I will usually just target those spots, but I will still glance through the rest of the manuscript, because having that all tied together in the big picture is really important for a developmental edit.
Okay, cool.
Excellent. So once the author feels like they have their story in good shape as far as the overall form of it, then do you move on to content editing? Is that the next step? Or
content editing is actually, some people call line editing also content editing, and other people call developmental editing content editing.
Mm-hmm.
I usually think of developmental editing as more content editing. After developmental edits, I move on to line editing.
Okay. So,
which is a little bit different from the way some editors do it, in the vein of, I will often leave when I'm doing a developmental edit. If I know that I'm going to be doing multiple steps with this author, I will often leave the tiny detail things to be cleaned up in the line edits, because it just comes through better, and then you don't overload the author.
Okay. So can you tell me what a line edit involves?
I rip the sentences apart and I put them back together. That's the very blunt 2-second version. Basically, it is going over sentences line by line with a fine-tooth comb and saying, you know what, your tone is great here, but these words don't make any sense. So can we work on refining that? Or you used this word here and I think you meant this. And if you did mean that, then we need to change the wording a little bit. But if you meant this thing over here that is the correct word for this, we need to change the context a little bit because it doesn't match. So it's basically sentences and details of that. And that's where things like detail continuity things usually come in too. Like, hey, he was wearing a red shirt in the last scene. I don't think he changed shirts yet. Did he? So that's most of what we deal with in a line edit. Is just tone and sentence structure. And like, I love what you've done with this sentence, but I'm not sure it fits the overall paragraph. That's also when we'll split paragraphs that are too word heavy, or combine paragraphs that don't need to be split.
Okay.
So it's basically just, layering the tone.
So, and then after a line edit, would you move into copy editing?
Yes.
So tell us what copy editing is. How is that different from line editing?
Line editing tends to target the words that you use and the structure of your sentences. Copy editing is more about punctuation. So when I'm doing a book that is layered enough, heavy enough that I have to split the copy and line edits, I don't always. Like, there are a lot of books that I do, especially romance books. I don't have to split a copy and line edit. Usually I can do them all in one because it's punctuation and words, and the books aren't usually complicated enough that I have to do them in two separate stages or I'll overwhelm the author. Like, I could do fantasies in one stage, but it would pretty much overwhelm the author.
So by overwhelm,
and also, documents don't work if you get too many pages or too many corrections on a single page. They won't work.
So by overwhelming, you just mean that you're trying to have the author correct too many things at one time, and it might just be too much for them to take in and process, as well as the functionality on the actual document. Right?
Yeah, it's like overstimulation, basically. They go into it and there are a billion changes all over the page and they're not sure where to start, and they just start incorporating the changes. But wait, maybe I don't want that change there, but why is this change here and this change isn't over here? It just gets way too confusing. And it's, like your ADHD, of that hyperstimulation. You just go in and it's like, I can't do this.
See, I just go, accept all 4,000 changes. Great. Then I'm good. And then I'll read through it just to make sure it still sounds fine. That's what I do.
So, when she talks about, so I usually, when I'm working with Arielle, I usually get a line and copy edit combined from her, because I do write romance and my structure is usually pretty solid by the time it gets to her. But I still do have usually over 1,000 corrections that she's made on every manuscript that I get back from her. And so if it's something that you're not used to, I can, especially if you're a newer author. So over the years, there are a lot of mistakes that I try to avoid because I know I'm prone to do them. And so I think she would have probably had triple that amount if she'd been editing some of my earlier books versus the one she has now. So I definitely understand the overwhelm thing. But it's amazing the level of what's like cleanliness, precision that happens in your manuscript when somebody whose only focus is sentence level and word level, matters. Instead of me, when every time I try to self-edit, my brain is constantly, should I reword this, or like maybe I need to go back in and foreshadow this. Like I can't ever completely focus on where my commas are going and all that sort of stuff. So it's really great that I can have somebody whose brain is purely focused on that one thing to go through my manuscript for me. Now, once somebody's gone through and done all of this stuff, does that mean the manuscript is perfect? No, it's not
usually.
It's not likely going to happen. So then we need to move on to the next level, which is proofreading. So what do you do with proofreading? I mean, obviously it's finding all the little things in there, but how do you make that happen, and how does that process work for you?
You basically just go in and it's, I'm looking for the typos. So you read it thoroughly and you just That is what you're there to catch the typos. You're there to catch, oh, that word was misspelled, or oh, this person formatted this manuscript for ebook, so I have that formatted file, but the formatting sometimes kicks in errors depending on what formatting program you use. It's really frustrating. So that's what you're looking for. You're looking for, somebody mistyped the as TEH, or this letter was left off this word, either at the beginning or at the end, or this paragraph wound up being repeated twice accidentally.
Mm-hmm.
So it's things like that. And like mine, I did go ahead and send my manuscript to an editor as well, because I manage most of the editing rounds myself on it. I can do that, but final proofread, I need somebody else to do it for me on my own work. So I sent it to a fantastic editor. Love her. She's super. And she sent it back, and there were a bunch of places where commas had gotten left out or commas had gotten messed up. There were some double period areas, that kind of thing. So that's what you're looking for, is just when, like, you'll go in to retype a sentence after you get your copy and line round back, and you'll automatically hit period at the end of that sentence, even though the period was already there. So then it leaves it in as a double period, because you didn't intentionally put it in there, but you miss it too as you're going, because it was just an automatic thing.
Yeah.
So you're basically just looking for those typos.
I've definitely found that I add more errors back into my manuscript when I'm fixing things than I'm fixing almost. And it's really frustrating. I almost feel like
That's why you accept all changes. And then you
so since I do a line and copy edit at the same time, there's a lot of things where Arielle's like, Michelle, you're showing instead of you're telling instead of showing here, or you had her come into the room twice, or something where I can't just accept and I have to go through and actually fix something. And when that happens, that's when I definitely will add more typos into the mess that she's already cleaned up once. So do you suggest that somebody get somebody else to proofread than the person who did their line and copy edit, just so it's a completely fresh manuscript, or can the same person proofread it?
Usually I suggest a different proofreader, because once your line and copy editor has gone over it 4 or 5 times, then they start to miss things.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you also used them for developmental editing. It's where it's just like, if you've been through 3 rounds with them, they're going to miss things. Depending on the manuscript, how simple it is, how long it is, you can use the same person. And also it really kind of depends on how clean you tend to write. Like if you're really good and on top of that stuff, you can usually use the same proofreader that you did for line and copy edits, because there isn't a whole lot of changes. Well, there weren't a lot of changes they had to make it in the beginning, so there aren't going to be that many that they're going to have to catch in proofreading, and they won't have gone over it as many times, so you can usually just go ahead and use them. But in general, I suggest a different proofreader.
Okay. So are there some editing types that are better to combine or to use the same person for than others? Like, is proofreading the only one you should get somebody else for, or like, how do you prefer to work with manuscripts?
That really depends. Sometimes you can take a client from the very beginning and go all the way to the end with them. If their books are tonally, if you're a good match with that author, if you can slip into their head more easily, if you know that author really, really well, then you can usually take them. And also if they have a bit more experience, so they're not total newbie coming into it, then you can usually take them and go quite a ways with them, if not all the way. For authors who are just starting out, sometimes it's better if they go to a more critical author for their critique, or which is something we didn't really talk about, but is basically a scaled down version of a developmental edit. You focus much more on just the big picture, and you don't get into as many details as you would with a developmental edit, like where I would go through a developmental edit and I might send back 5 pages of notes. I would try to keep that to 2.5 or 3 pages for a critique. And it would basically be the really big things like, you need to research this more and you need to work on this more and you need to research this more and you need to work on this more. It's basically saying, yeah, you have a manuscript you're ready to take to editing, or no, you're not. You don't. So for newbies starting out, especially ones who have a lot of growth to do, it is frequently more helpful to get a critique from one person and then go through developmental with somebody else, and sometimes even to split your line and copy edit and do that elsewhere too. But I have a few different clients where we do it all the way. My writing buddies, because we are pretty critical in the writing stages. So we have no compunction tearing each other's work apart and going, wow, no, redo it. And it's a lot easier for us. So about the only thing we split off and have other people do occasionally is a proofread. But I've worked with several clients where I was a good fit for their developmental edit. I was not such a good fit for their line and copy edit. They needed to go elsewhere for that. Or usually because I'm more critical in the developmental editing stage and the critique stage, so I can give them that really tough feedback that they need to grow. But then when it comes to line and copy edits, they want to go in with a little bit of a softer hand and just say, okay, maybe I need a lot more encouragement at this stage than I try to be encouraging to authors, but sometimes they need just that little bit of extra. And also they need more time on it. So they need like 3 months for a line and copy edit instead of 2 weeks. They just need to go back and forth over it again and again. And I don't usually have that kind of time to give to a client. It really kind of depends. But usually if you're a very new author starting out, try out some different people for the different stages. And or I do have a couple clients where they already had line and copy editors. So we just work on developmental, or they already had a developmental editor like Michelle. So we just do line and copy.
Okay. I think we've pretty much covered all the different types pretty well. I was going to ask you before we get into some of the other questions. I think we had a couple over there. So is there something that you wish authors understood about the editing process that you would like to say right now to anybody listening? Like, what do you wish they knew?
If I return your manuscript with 3,000 comments, it doesn't mean I hate you.
Do
or
you
your
get
work.
that?
It just means that I really went into detail trying to help you make it better. And also, if I send you a manuscript back and there are a lot of detailed comments, read it, let it sit, walk away, have an emotional reaction if you need to, because a lot of people do, and I totally get that. And just wait for a few days or a week, take some time, think about it, react to it. It's okay. It's okay to be emotional about it. This is your story. It is totally okay to cry. I mean, I'm sorry I made you cry, but it is okay to cry. It is okay to get out your reactions and then come back. And also, 100% ask me any questions you have, because if I didn't make something clear, and I am definitely only human, there are times I do not make something clear that wow, I can't believe I didn't make that clear kind of a thing. But 100%, if you are even the slightest bit confused over something I said, or whether you think I hated something, no, I didn't hate that. I was just confused in that section. So I'm trying to help you polish it and bring it through more clearly. Ask me. Absolutely ask me. Send me a 2,000 word email if that's what it takes. Ask me your questions.
Arielle and I have had some great back and forth conversations about my work after she sent me all of her initial edits. And that always provides a lot more clarity to me on specific points. And sometimes there's something that I want to discuss a little bit more that I'm not quite sure how to fix until we've gone over it a little bit more. And then sometimes there's something I've been worried about that I wasn't sure if it was a problem for her. And sometimes if I mention it, she'll be like, well, now that you mention it, I did kind of have a few thoughts about that. I was okay with it. Or she'll be like, on the second read through, it worked better for me than on the first time. And, that's kind of an important thing for me, because most of my readers, I want to get it right the first time they read it. So maybe if it takes a second read through to work, then I have work to do. So I appreciate the back and forth conversation. That's important. And it's always valuable to have a positive working relationship with your editor where you know that they are your teammate, that they are trying to help you become the best and make your manuscript the best you can. And not somebody who's out there to just like wreck your self-esteem or, something like that. And one thing that I love about working with an editor that over time, as you've had more and more manuscripts with them, not only do you kind of build this good positive relationship where you can have open communication, but I get better with every edit, and every time she teaches me things, and I appreciate that part of the author-editor relationship, which is why I wanted to do a class on it. So we're going to get into a lot more details like that on how to find an editor, how to communicate with an editor, how to have a good relationship and improve over your career. And she'll get to talk about all the things that she wishes that authors understood and authors could know and what it's like from her point of view, because so often all we see from our editors is the red marks and the comments and the sidebar and there's a person behind that. So I'm looking forward to that class. So a lot of people are we're getting a few more questions. So one more before we get over there. What are common mistakes that you see authors making when hiring an editor?
They don't spend enough time. They don't leave enough time for the process. Like, I will have clients come to me and they're like, I have to get this book out in 3 weeks and I need a line and copy edit on it. And they don't even ask the question, hey, do you think we're a good fit? Or they don't really leave enough time for trying to figure out if you're a good fit. And that can be kind of frustrating because then you're pressured as the editor to just like get their thing and make it better and just get it back to them. And you don't really have time to build any kind of rapport or relationship with them. And for some people, it doesn't really matter so much if they have that relationship with their editor. They feel like they can send you the manuscript, you'll go through and you'll make their changes, you'll send it back to them, they'll make their changes, and then they'll publish it. And that works for them. I don't tend to work as well with those clients, which is why I usually refer them to other editors, just because that's not my style as much. And I want them to be able to work with an editor that does fit their style, who can do that for them. And it's just not me. But in general, the biggest mistake I see authors make when hiring an editor is they don't leave enough time for the process. And the second biggest mistake is they don't look around enough. Like, they'll take the first editor that comes up that strikes their fancy, or they assume that because you worked well with a friend of theirs, you're going to work well with them. And that's not always true. And it doesn't mean anybody's wrong or at fault. It just means as a personality, you don't work as well with that person.
Mm-hmm. So do you find...
I don't tend to, like, if anyone's familiar with the MBTI system, I don't always work super well with SFP types, just because they tend to need more hand-holding and more of a slower, layered process. I do have a couple of fantastic SFP clients I do love working with, but in general, over a wide range of personalities and time, I don't tend to work as well with them. They usually wind up needing a different editor.
So do you find that first chapters are a good way to kind of get a gauge for whether someone's a good fit? Do you do that, or how do you start that process of letting them and you gauge that potential relationship?
First chapters is usually what we do. I have found with new authors, it's not actually the best gauge. At this point, it's the process that I go through, but lately I have considered changing that up a little bit with new authors, because their first chapter is not always the best gauge, because your first chapter tends to be what you go over the most. And so they've worked on that, and it might be 5 times better than the rest of the manuscript. So I get the first chapter and I go through the first chapter. And I was like, okay, here's the level of editing you need. And then I get the manuscript and it's like, okay, we screwed up. We royally screwed up. We got to do something about this. So yes, with most authors, but not always, especially with new authors.
Okay. Who wants to go through our questions over here that we have?
I can.
Okay. Take it away, Victorine.
All right. Let me make sure I'm going up to the blah, 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 the top. All right. I think this is our first one. What is a good number to have for beta readers?
Ooh. Do any of you have thoughts on that?
I have used like 15 before, and that was too many.
I think 15 might be too many.
I think 3 is like a good number.
3 to 5, maybe 7 if you need a lot of advice. But yeah, 3 to 5 I think is good.
I think it depends on the quality of your beta readers. I mean, unless you have, if you have established relationships with them and you know what they're due for you, then you probably can limit it to just a few people who are going to do a great job for you. My experience of doing like 15 beta readers is in my time period where I was trying to find the good beta readers, and I was still getting a lot of those who were just basically fixing my typos.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, but
You know what I found is if you tell one beta reader, all I want you to do is look for repeat words. And then tell the other beta reader, all I want you to do is look for passive stuff, or, and just give them a task. Then maybe you can use more beta readers. And
one tip that I always like to give people when they do use beta readers is to compile all of your documents. Instead of reading one beta reader's comments and this one and all different comments, it's really helpful to compile them in one document, because then you can it gets overwhelming. You have to prepare yourself like, okay, there's gonna be a lot of comments in one document. But it also gives you kind of a bird's eye view of this didn't work for anybody. Like, every one of my beta readers hated this section, or everybody commented how much they loved this thing. And so it can help you to see the not really the average, but just in general where the strong parts and the weak parts of your story are. So that's really helpful. And I think I had one beta reader that was really good at helping me to have a better perspective on feminist views, because I'm not personally a feminist. But it helped me to see some things in my document that even I agreed I needed to change that I wouldn't have thought of on my own. And so even though that particular beta reader didn't do a whole lot for me story structure wise, I always really appreciated getting those specific comments, because it allowed me to step back and question things like, oh, I do need to make sure that she is consenting to this kiss, that he is forcing on her, that there needs to be some kind of eye communication or physical sign that she wants this like he does, and it wasn't so much that I was forcing the kiss that she didn't want, but I wasn't communicating to the reader that she did. And so it was just that kind of, I think having beta readers having specific purposes is important. And if you recognize that somebody's good at something, maybe keep them around, even if you have more than you need to have. I'm rambling at this point.
All right.
Yeah, I've personally found that around 5 is what works best for me. I know people who do the whole 15 or 20, like one of my writing buddies tends to send out her books chapter by chapter, and she has a really long beta list, and that works for her because she basically gets a lot of feelings, reactions, and that spurs her on, but she already knows what she's doing as far as the story goes. Like, we talk about it as she writes it, so she already knows what she's doing with that. So that many comments coming in don't really throw her off. For me, I'm much more of a big picture person, so I pretty much have to get the manuscript done before I send it out to beta readers, and then once I do, I definitely tend to prefer like 3, 4, 5 And it took me quite a while to find them. There were a lot of beta readers we just didn't work well together. So we don't do that anymore. But yeah, for me, 5 to 7 is about ideal once you find the good ones.
Good. All right. We have another question. What makes for a good developmental edit? What am I looking for that would be considered valuable feedback?
I would say somebody who really understands what your end goal is. Like one thing I do when I'm developmental editing for anybody, especially for somebody new, is ask them, what inspired you to write this story? Where did you start? Where did you come from when you sat down to write this book? And what do you hope people take away from this story? And the answer to that last one, I usually find myself explaining to clients, it doesn't have to be anything deep or complex or anything like that. All you have to say to that is, I want people to come away feeling like they had a really good time, or I want people to want to curl up with a cup of tea and a cookie to read this, or I want them to come away feeling like, oh, they lived happily ever after. That's okay. Like when I ask, what do you want people to take away from this book? It doesn't have to be anything cerebral that you answer with. It can be something as seemingly simple as, I want them to come away feeling happy. And then that helps me as the editor go into the book and say, okay, here is your end goal. So here's what we're going to do, or what we need to do to get there. And what you're looking for in a good developmental edit is an author who will tell you your story structure is good or bad or somewhere in between. They will talk about the story structure. They will talk about the character arcs. They will talk about the world, because even romances have world building. You are setting up this happy world, or this world where the end goal is that they are living happily in love, whether they're married or engaged or whatever, kissing all the time, whatever the case is. And that's basically what you need out of a good developmental edit, is an editor who will talk the structure of the story, the structure of the character arcs, the overall tone of the book, and who will give you feedback on whether you're on track to make your goal at the end of the story, your end picture of the story. Are you on track to reach that or not?
Perfect. All right. What is a practical / realistic cost for these different editors?
That is a very complicated question, honestly, because there's industry standard. And then one thing that a lot of editors have started doing is charging a different price for indie authors, because they recognize that most indie authors are working on a very different budget than even nonfiction authors or article writers or anybody who's asking you for a brief edit before they submit to a traditional publication or publishing company. And then there are other editors who tend to break it down as far as repeat clients get discounts, or new clients get discounts, or both. And I charge a lot below industry standard, mostly because one of my primary motivations for going was that I knew scores, literally, of indie authors who needed better editors, but who couldn't afford to pay industry standard. And my goal going in was to make editing affordable for them. So, and my prices are still on the low end. Like, I could raise them another probably $1 per editing tier at least. But at this point, I just haven't felt like putting in that kind of trouble, which is a little bit awful. But yes, I am definitely on the low end of editing cost. Basically, if you're going into an editor and they're charging a lot less than I am, you might want to question if there's something wrong with the editor, or if they're super, super new. Like super new, okay, but otherwise, maybe they're not quite what they say they are, maybe.
So with all that being said, Arielle, you can go to ariellebaileyediting.com, and she does have her pricing structure on her website. And any editor should have their pricing structure laid out on their website. It should not be a surprise to you what your editing is going to cost. And that can play into your decision, of course, but you should be able to find it on any editor's website.
One thing some editors do is they actually look over the manuscript first before estimating a cost for you. Like that works well for some editors, but definitely don't commit to anything until you get that estimate back. That estimate should be free. They should not be charging you for that. If they are, run the other direction.
And if that's their
That estimate should
policy,
be free.
that will be on their web. If that's their policy, they'll have that on their website instead.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
All right. What's an editor's pet peeve? We talked a little bit about this, but what's something that bugs you?
Wow, there are there are a few, but usually when a client immediately responds with, "You didn't understand what I was saying.
Mm-hmm.
Did you read what I said?" Because this is an emotional reaction coming from you. It's not always. Like sometimes I have had a client respond with, "Okay, here's what I was trying to say. I don't think that was really understood." And then I can say, "Oh, no. You're right. It wasn't understood. I didn't understand that. So let's look at it again and see if it was me having a bad day," because we do have our bad days, or it was something else that you really do need to work on. But in general, firing off an emotional reaction at me before you've allowed yourself time to absorb it. And yeah, that is a pet peeve. Another one is, okay, this one drives me batty, where they assume that because you are the editor, they don't have to learn anything about story structure or grammar or punctuation. I am not your copywriter. I am your editor. I am not here to keep track of all of the rules for you so you don't have to learn any of them. I am here to help you figure out which ones you need to learn and which ones are just like, I'm sorry, nobody in their right mind can keep all of the rules about American English commas in their head. I can't even do that. I wind up in pretty much every manuscript I do going back and double checking my notes for, is this comma supposed to be here or isn't it? Because it's impossible. The American English comma rules are insane.
Yep.
But that one really, really pushes my buttons when a client just assumes you're going to do all that work for me. I'm just going to send you the manuscript. I don't have to keep any of that. In my head, I don't even have to learn any of that. You do your changes. I'll just accept them all and send it on. And it's like, no, sorry, can't do that.
That would drive me batty too. All right. Deidre wants to know, people always say to newbie authors that if they can't afford a developmental edit when just starting, to just do copy, edit, and proof. Do you think this is smart? If not, what would you recommend?
That is kind of a tricky one, Deidre. I assume your name's pronounced Deidre. I don't always remember how to say that one. I actually don't advise skipping a developmental edit when you're a newbie author. I think it's actually the most important round, because as a newbie author, you want to put out a product that is not going to send people running for the hills and never picking up another book of yours again. And it's usually better to get a developmental edit first. And if you can't afford one, you can see if an editor offers a critique instead, which is where you'll get the main points you would get in a developmental edit. You're just not going to get it as detailed or as deep, but it will still hit the high marks of what you have to fix. Like that's something I've worked with a couple of clients before on, where they can't afford editing rounds, but they can afford a critique. And that tends to help them, because then they can just go through and they can fix a few of those things up, and then they can get like a proofread or a copy edit And they're turning out a much better work than if they had just gone with a copy edit and a proofread, because if that's all they had gone with, they would have missed some big things. So in general, if you can, see if you can find an inexpensive editor who's still good at what they do, but charges on the lower end for critique, and or seriously find some good critique partners. People who will try to understand your voice and who won't just be like, fix this, fix this, fix this. Drives me crazy. Sorry, that's not a good critique partner. People who will try to understand your voice, people who will talk with you about the story, people who will be interested in the story. Because if you have somebody who's interested in the story, but who can look at it critically, you're already 5 steps above the baseline, because that person is invested, and yet also invested in you as an author, not just the story.
Good answer. So, following what you just said, what is a good time frame to plan out for the editing process so you don't feel rushed?
That depends on how long your book is and what rounds you still need on it. A developmental edit on a 50,000 word, it also depends on genre. A developmental edit on a 50,000 word romance, that shouldn't take more than a month at most. Like, I can usually do those in a week. If I don't, and sometimes I'm multitasking those, like I'll team up and I'll read the first one on Monday, I'll read the second one on Tuesday, I'll go back and I'll make all of the notes for both on Wednesday and Thursday, and then Friday I'll go over and do my double check and triple check on all of the notes and send them off. For a fantasy, you're going to look at least double that time, if not triple, because fantasy has very different conventions. Romance is as fascinating and as complex as it can get. It's actually a pretty simple point-to-point genre. You know, you're going to have your meat, you're going to have your development, you're going to have your, occasionally there's a misunderstanding. Well, I mean, sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. It depends on what subgenre you're writing. If you're writing Hallmark, there's going to be a rather obvious misunderstanding toward the end, and then you're going to, match it all up and everybody's going to live happily ever after. So it's fairly simple point to point as far as most romance subgenres. But fantasy, you're pulling from a very different set of conventions, and it's usually going to take longer. So developmental edits for fantasy of a 50,000 word, I'm not sure I know anyone who writes fantasy in 50,000 words, honestly. Even contemporary fantasies or urban fantasies tend to run 75,000 words. So definitely you're going to allow 2 to 3 times that. But if you're writing romance, which I'm going to assume you are because you're on a romance writing podcast, although I shouldn't assume that because I don't write romance, and yet here I am. There we go.
I think you blame me for that.
And if you're writing romance and you run 30,000 words to 50,000 words, allow a month for developmental editing. For any other kinds of edits, you're looking at about a month for line edits, unless you're a pretty clean author, and then 2 weeks, 3 weeks. But get on your editor's schedule 3 months ahead of time, if possible, if not 4 months. Some people are booked pretty far out. Like at the moment, I'm booked through, it's July. I think I'm not fully booked. I have a couple of open spots that I'm keeping open because I'm pretty sure I'm going to need them for other things down the road, including Michelle's books last minute. Which is fun because once you get to know your client, you get to know that about them. I know Michelle's books are going to be last minute. So I build extra time into my editing schedule so that I can go with those. And if by some chance we're actually ahead of schedule or something like that, then I can usually find some other thing to fill it, or I can slide in somebody last minute. I get a lot of last minute requests. So it's like, okay, well, I can actually slide you in last minute here because I had this happen or I didn't have this happen.
Or Michelle's
that is the nice thing with long-term. That is the good thing about long-term relationships is that you get to figure that out. But in general, yes, try to get on your editor's schedule 3 to 4 months out. again, that's something that's going to depend on your relationship. Like if you know your editor's super popular and super busy, then you might need to say like, hey, I'm going to have a book in probably 6 months. Can you work on that? Otherwise, maybe your editor only needs 2 weeks warning. But in general, build in a few months for that and go with that as your goal.
Perfect. All right. Well, you may have already answered this, but if you can only afford one type of edit, which one is the most important?
Oh, honestly, probably line editing, because that's going to catch some of the things that a developmental edit would have caught, and it's also going to catch some of the things a copy edit would catch. So it's kind of a good baseline.
Good.
Is go with a line edit, basically.
And what's your favorite genre to edit?
Oh, that's a tough one. Because
It's not
tend to
romance.
prefer. No, it's not. I mean, I love my romance clients, but romance is not my favorite genre to edit. And ironically, neither is epic fantasy. I enjoy reading some epic fantasy, but I do not enjoy editing it all the time because it usually gives me headaches if I can't take some breaks between it, because there's just so much going on. And a lot of epic fantasy has a heavier tone than I am a very dark person as far as fiction goes. Like somebody asks me, hey, is this movie dark? I had this conversation with 3 of my friends yesterday. Hey, is this movie dark? And I said, no, it's not dark at all. And one of them comes on and goes, Arielle, this movie's really dark. Like this, don't just know that going in. Okay, this is a dark movie. I'm like, okay, if you say so. Like the Star Wars sequel trilogy is dark. Oops. Which, it is when you come at it objectively, but I forget that. I don't have that filter. I have a very high darkness tolerance. And epic fantasy is, I don't mind the darkness, but what usually means I can't do too much of it at once is the heaviness. It has a very heavy tone sometimes. You think about Game of Thrones. If you've read a Game of Thrones book, I have not. I skipped those. Then it's kind of heavy. The Witcher, I don't know if anyone here is like, that's kind of a heavier tone going into those two. Lord of the Rings, a lot of people find heavy. I personally love Lord of the Rings, but it is, if you're not used to that kind of thing, definitely a heavier tone. Or what's another one? Guy Gabriel Kay's tend to, and it's just too much for me to do too much of it. I can do some of it, but there's not usually enough humor mixed in that I can go back to back and do 5 epic fantasy manuscripts in a row.
Do you like
so I would
fairy
say
tale?
my favorite genre is probably, yes, I love fairy tales. I adore fairy tales. So my favorite genre is probably, it's kind of tricky because fairy tale retelling is a genre, but it's not a genre. You can have urban fantasy fairy tale retellings. There are not nearly enough of those in the world, but that is a conversation for a different day. And you can have contemporary fantasy fairy tale retellings, also not enough of those in the world. I could literally talk for an hour about what kind of fairy tale retellings we need in the world, but I'm not going to go there. You can have epic fantasy fairy tale retellings. You can have non-fantasy at all. You can have contemporary romance fairy tale retellings. So fairy tale retellings are kind of a genre, but they're not exactly a genre. I would say contemporary fantasy is probably my favorite genre to edit. Also urban fantasy. I love urban fantasy. Just because I get to help bring contemporary fantasy I love, because there's not a lot of it in the world. As far as actually being a blend between urban fantasy and epic, like contemporary fantasy as a genre is not as well known, it's not as well understood, and it's not as often written. So I love editing that for the novelty and because I love contemporary fantasy. Probably my favorite genre. Historical fantasy is good too. Sometimes. But yeah, probably contemporary fantasy.
Great. Well, that's all of our questions.
Deidre was laughing at my
Alright.
face
I
when
saw that.
Arielle's talking about last minute. I'm like, oh, that's me.
Thank you for the questions. They were really good.
That was awesome. Got great discussion going there. Okay, so thank you so much, guys, for tuning in with us tonight and for participating with some great questions for Arielle. We just want to talk real quick about our Writing Gals Conference, which is going to be live August 6th through 8th. It's going to be a virtual conference hosted on the Teachable platform. So you'll be able to have access to all 41 classes plus the live panels and extra live content in the conference Facebook group. And you'll have access to all of it for 2 months for the extraordinary price of $199. So you can find all the information about it on our website, thewritinggals.com, or on our Facebook group. And if you haven't joined our Facebook group, then come on over and join it. And if you like this podcast and want to see more in the future, be sure and hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you can find out every time we're going to go live, which is mostly every first and third Thursday of the month. So continue to follow us, and we hope you will sign up for our podcast so you can have more from all of us in these conferences, classes we've been talking about, and especially more from Arielle. So Arielle, thanks for being with us tonight. And thanks all of you.
Thanks for having me.
It's been lovely. I'm having so much fun getting to know her in person. Good night. Thanks for staying up late with us.